Good night, everyone, and welcome to tonight's discussion. Let's first begin with a simple question. What if the Soviet Union didn't collapse? Imagine a world where the red flag still flies over the Kremlin, where the Cold War dynamics continue to shape global politics, and where the USSR remains a superpower and influencing our people's daily lives. Numerous works of fiction have explored this alternative reality. There's a famous game in America called Command and Conquer Red Alert, which imagines a world without Hitler in which the Soviet Union starts to attack the world and try to rule the whole world. Yet they were counterattacked by the Americans and other countries. There is a very famous Russian series that I have watched, which is about a group of Russians coming back to Chernobyl incident, and they succeeded to avoid it, which allowed the Soviet Union to continue to survive until today, in which conversely, a civil war broke out in America and allowed the Soviet Union to become the ruler of the unipolar world. There's also a very famous Japanese fiction called Steins Gate, which imagined that people use time machine to pass signals to the past, in which the Soviet Union managed to survive until 2010s, and Vladimir Putin becomes the general secretary of the Soviet Union in the 21st century. There are also numerous fictions in China which imagined people traveling back to the past and becoming the leaders of the Soviet Union. One of them is quite famous, which imagined a person who became Yanayev, who successfully launched the August coup and then ruled the Soviet Union, which allowed it to continue to survive to the 2020s and win the whole Cold War. So what makes people today want to imagine if the Soviet Union collapsed? And we can investigate how the Soviet Union managed to survive in people's imagination. From my perspective, most of these fictions imagined that the Soviet Union tried to take the path of the China, who succeeded to impose economic reform while maintaining strict political control, which allowed it to survive, as people think. So it is important to find why the Soviet Union didn't take China's path. And if it did, could it have survived without any political reform imposed by Gorbachev and any other Russian leaders? So let's first talk about compare and contrast between the Soviet reform and China reform. First, the Soviet reform, I think most people are very familiar with are the perestroika and glasnost, in which the perestroika, in English, restructuring, means economic reform in the 1980s to revitalize the Soviet economy through the introduction of limited market mechanisms, reduction of central planning, and encouragement of private enterprise within a predominantly socialist system. And another famous reform, which is mainly political reform, is glasnost, which in English means openness. It is a political reform to promote openness and transparency in government institutions, freedom of information, and an easing of repressive controls over society and the press. And next, let's talk about the China's reform, which is reform and opening up, imposed by Deng Xiaoping. It is widely viewed as a gradual transition from a planned economy to a socialist market economy or a market economy to ensure political stability and economic prosperity, in which there are two very famous policies. The first one is a household responsibility system, HRS, which is to allocate parcels of land from the collective farm to individual households, who are then responsible for meeting certain production quotas set by the state, while any surplus produced beyond the quota could be sold by the households in the market to gain extra profits. The second policy is the township and village enterprises, which is mainly an industrial policy compared to the agricultural policy. It is a market-oriented public enterprises under the purview of local governments based in townships and villages. And TVEs are instrumental in absorbing rural labor and transferring surplus agricultural workers into industrial and manufacturing factories to further promote urbanization and industrialization in China. And what is the outcome of the Soviet reform and Chinese reform? Well, we can find the outcome in these two very clear maps. At the left, the Soviet Union, we saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union into various countries. And I believe the consequences of the dissolution of the Soviet Union still exists today. Let's see the Ukrainian war and the conflicts between Russia and many other countries, and also these countries themselves. And on the right, we can see the surging China economy after the Chinese reform. So many people reach the conclusion that Chinese reform is very successful, while Soviet reform is totally a failure. And they started to think that if the Soviet Union imposed a Chinese reform, we can imagine a Soviet Union still surviving today, just as the fictions in the first page I shared. So, let's consult the academies and see how they think about this opinion. The classical explanation of the Chinese reform and the Soviet reform is quite meeting the common understanding, which is that gradual economic reform is superior to radical political change for inducing efficient economic markets, which caused the success of the China and the failure of the Soviet Union. However, recent research somewhat reached a consensus that it is a quite lazy interpretation of communist transition events based on a very shallow and teleological historical vision. If you observe the two countries' history in a quite different timelines, you can find that in the 1950s and the 1960s, the Soviet Union becomes the one with incremental economic reform and no political reform, which is the Kosygin reform in 1965. And China is actually the one with cataclysmic economic and political changes presented in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which lead to disastrous consequences in China. So, what is the actual explanation of this difference? There's also an individual explanation. This is a photo of Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping when Gorbachev met him in 1989 before the Tiananmen Square incident. So after the meeting, Deng Xiaoping says, "This man looks smart, but is actually quite stupid." And if you question that, it is actually what he said, both from his son's memory and his translator's memory. So this is quite true, I would say. And most people may just interpret this as a different quality of the leaders, whereas Gorbachev is not very smart on the politics, while Deng Xiaoping is a very realistic and practical politician, which could deal with the different obstacles in the reforms. However, I would say that although this makes some sense, I would say, and I would say most political science researchers will agree with this, like Zuboff in his famous book. But I would say that this is still not the whole picture, as there will be some structural explanation of why Soviet reform failed and the Chinese reform succeeded. So here comes my podcast, my podcast today, which is the advantage of underdevelopment, why the Soviet Union couldn't take China's path. So my research question is, what structural factors prevented the Soviet Union from implementing reforms similar to those in China? First I'll introduce my thesis, and then I'll further introduce how they work. China's advantage of underdevelopment, characterized by its chaotic and decentralized political system, dysfunctional central planning institutions, and an underdeveloped economy with impoverished living conditions, played a pivotal structural role in facilitating its sustained economic reform while overcoming significant obstacles. In contrast, the Soviet Union's disadvantage of overdevelopment, characterized by its stable and top-down centralized political system, highly advanced planning system, and relatively well-developed economy with higher living standards, created significant obstacles to economic reforms, in which Gorbachev tried to overcome these obstacles through rallying support beyond the party and purging internal dissenters in a bid to enforce economic reforms through political reforms, which paradoxically accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in a first glance, I believe most people will think it's a quite strange argument, as we always see development as something good, especially economic development, social development. But here I'm arguing that it is just the advantage of underdevelopment that makes the China's reform possible and makes the Soviet Union makes it quite impossible for the Soviet Union to imitate China's economic reform and take its path. So then I'll give more details about these theses in the next page. So firstly, the chaotic and decentralized political system after Cultural Revolution fostered a system of fiscal decentralization and regional self-sufficiency, empowering local cadres with the motivation to drive economic reforms to compete with their counterparts in other provinces for economic benefits and performance incentives, which the Soviet Union's relatively stable political climate and the top-down centralized system cannot replicate. The second one is dysfunctional central planning institutions impaired the leadership's ability to sustain the old model of planned economy, which inadvertently set the stage to compel exploration of alternative models, namely the socialist market economy. By contrast, the Soviet Union's highly advanced central planning system continuously devised plans aligned with leadership goals and avoided major failures, which caused it to be so concrete to destroy and replace. Thirdly, the underdevelopment economy with impoverished living conditions positioned economic reform not as a contentious issue, but as a widely beneficial win-win option for all stakeholders. This scenario ensured robust grassroots support for reform, backed by the top leaders in Beijing. Unlike in the Soviet Union, where relatively higher living standards made economic reform nearly a zero-sum game, which ignited the grassroots resistance from the bottom and leading to the failure of the agricultural reform in Russia. First, let's talk about the chaotic and decentralized political system in China. And here you can see an image that shows how the political system of China works in Deng Xiaoping's era, which you can see that a clear feature of the whole image is that the power is split by various factions. You can find the elders at the left side leading by Deng. You can find the leftist faction, which are not directly belonging to Deng, but belonging to Hua Guofeng and Li Peng's factions that somewhat opposed the whole scale market economic reform and still supporting the model of planned economy. And there is also the reform faction of Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, which are also not fully supporting Deng Xiaoping's faction, which finally leads to the well-known 1989 Tiananmen Square. And also there are urban students. Some of them are earlier Red Guards, and there are quite complex ideologies in the urban students and also local citizens. So why did this chaotic and decentralized political system produce so effective economic reform, which are conflicting with our common knowledge? So first, I like to say that the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution in China during the 1950s and 1960s actually decentralized the regional economy, as we found from Paget's article in 2012. So in the Great Leap Forward, as China wanted to further develop its economy, it started to split the central power to the local cadres to further motivate them to develop the agricultural and industrial economy. Although it finally leads to some disastrous consequences, both in the agricultural and industrial field, as we know, but the power of the economy is actually decentralized to the regional cadres. And in the Cultural Revolution, this power is further decentralized as cadres in the central government and the provincial level of government are destroyed by the Red Guards and Mao's factions, which leads the economic power to be further split to local cadres, in which they have a large say in the industrial and agricultural developments. And after that, you can find that after the Cultural Revolution, the local cadres have many power. First of all, they control the local enterprises, except for the very large and hyper concentration of some specific enterprises. And also they control significant political power after the Cultural Revolution, as after Mao died, there are various political factions who cannot control the central power, which causes it to be split among different provinces. So after the Cultural Revolution, Deng and other top leaders find that they cannot control the local cadres to do what they do, and they need to always accommodate with their interests, both economically and politically. So this leads to the fiscal decentralization reform after the Cultural Revolution, which allowed provincial and local leaders to control locally invested industries and allow them to reinvest discretionary revenues from the local enterprises and gain collective benefits, which allow them to become which turn them from extractors to entrepreneurs. And this economic power leads to the competition between provincial and local governments to develop local enterprises and attract foreign investments, which allowed the economy to be further developed by the local leaders instead of the top-down economic command, which naturally leads to the economic competition in the market economy. I would not say that this consequence is very expected by the Beijing, as Deng from the start of the reform, he himself doesn't predict the very high economic growth rate and the consequences of these reforms, but it is a very floating dynamics between the central government and the local government. And we could find that it is quite this political situation is quite different in the Soviet Union. with a very stable and top-down centralized political system. We can find from the image on the left, we can find that the general secretary controlled almost all parts of the political systems, and all ministries, whether ministries, Politburo, or Congress of People's Deputies, all need to hear the command of the general secretary of the Communist Party. So Padrat, in his book, commented the Soviet Union as a dual hierarchy with a central command system ruled by the general secretary and ministries, with plenty of political clans and family circles. So people ask why Gorbachev didn't impose Stern's reform. Actually, he imposed Stern's reform and somewhat imitated his measures. The law on state enterprises imposed in 1987 proposes a wholesale market for intermediate goods to monetize social markets. And it leads to a disastrous end, as we all know, as Soviet production fiercely dropped from nearly 4% to minus 3% between 1989 to 1987 to 1990. And there are three main reasons for this failure. So firstly, the ministries absorbed 90% of the surplus to fulfill their plan. And secondly, the party cadres failed to transform themselves into entrepreneurs, as what happened in China. And the third one, which is a very basic one, is the hyper-concentration of state enterprises, which makes every industry a natural monopoly without market competition. So this is quite different from China's reform, as the Soviet political system is a quite stable and top-down system, in which the higher level of cadres can easily control what the lower cadres will do. And this leads to the failure of this economic reform, as we find. As ministries, they need to fulfill their jobs, so they command the lower level cadres to first put this surplus to fulfill, contribute this surplus to fulfill their plan, instead of reinvesting this surplus or putting them into the market to foster market competition. And also party cadres, they failed to gain profits from this process. So instead they become extractors instead of entrepreneurs. And secondly, there is a dysfunctional central planning system. So first, we need to know that in the Soviet Union, there is a commission called Central Statistical Administration, which has a ministerial status and is quite independent from regional authorities. It collects data from the local authorities and calculate them to make the planned economy work. And we can find a very similar ministry in China called State Statistical Bureau, SSB, which is a bureau level organization and can't issue any binding instructions. So to compare that, we can find that CSA issued 1,000 machine accounting stations. They have 1,000 machine accounting stations, 26 computers, and 1838 pieces of punch card equipment. In contrast, until 1980s, SSB still only has had 2 computers, and 90% of the data are handled manually, which leads to the China's bureau's inability to access accurate data and information necessary to sustain planned economy, which finally leads to the failure of Hua Guofeng, which is a previous leader between Deng Xiaoping that supported the model of planned economy to continue to operate in China. This leads to the failure of his 10-year development plan, which envisioned petroleum revenues to finance 120 large-scale industrial projects in 1978. The failure of the central planning system quickly leads to the collapse of the whole plan, as the petroleum production plateaued soon with no new wells discovered. This leads to the failure of the the conservative factions in China and allowed all leaders, including Hua Guofeng himself, to know that the planned economy model cannot continue to work in China, and they need to find alternative model, which leads to the market economy, socialist market economy. And finally, we can find that the third reason is the underdeveloped economy with impoverished living condition. So different from the Soviet Union, in China, reallocation of labor is a widely beneficial win-win option for all stakeholders. As the economy is already so developed, any new gains are seen as very beneficial. While the dissenters are allowed to maintain status quo, while in the Soviet Union they need to suffer from serious losses from the reform. We can find that in China, budgetary subsidies from provincial benefits for large inefficient plants, while the employees of these large inefficient plants are actually gradually drifted into lucrative alternatives instead of suddenly being fired and need to find their own way in the Soviet Union. And from Rosell and Swinen's article, we can find that the successful communist reform requires both top leadership support and grassroots pressure, which I think this sentence largely explains why it failed in the Soviet Union and succeeded in China. As we can use the example of agricultural reform. First, we talk about the household responsibility system and why it succeeded. It succeeded because it actually managed to increase agricultural output and reduce poverty, which reinforced the pro-reform groups led by Deng in Beijing. While higher living standards of the farmers created grassroots initiatives to spread across rural China. So it actually doesn't need Deng to say that, okay, we need to impose agricultural reform. Actually, it's that the top leaders permitted them and admitted the status quo, while the farmers themselves started to imitate others to impose this household responsibility system. And in the Soviet Union, we can find a very different picture, as the large subsidies and high wages in Soviet state farms ignited grassroots resistance due to fear of significant layoffs and lower wages after the reform. So actually, most reforms in the Soviet Union lead to a same result, which is a zero-sum game rather than a win-win game in China. As workers and farmers, they fear of their potential losses after the reform, as they already had relatively higher living standards. Where in China, as over 30 to 40% of the farmers are still in the fear of hunger every day and need to find the food for themselves, they are not so afraid of losing more as they cannot. So you can find the grassroots support in China to agricultural reform and how it failed in the Soviet Union due to the low grassroots support. And finally, that's the references of my work, and thanks to all these readers and thanks to my professor Savagunitsky in guiding me in this semester's courses. And thank you. And today's podcast is over. Thank you very much, and good night.